Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another bit of Total War, Warhammer 2, Quick Match gameplay. So this time around we are on the map Doomglades, playing as the Skaven against the Dwarves, with a bit of a Vanguard build. So, for those of you who remember, I've had actually a handful of videos, I suppose, of an old Vanguard build I used to do with Skaven, horde of Death Runners, with some Gutter Runners and Night Runners. So it's very similar to this, but we have gotten a slight improvement here, and that is with the inclusion of Tretch Craventail. Skaven now have a lord who actually has Vanguard deployment. And so for those of you who are wondering what Tretch is all about, he's not the best of combat lords. He's very much oriented at survival. He has crazy melee defense, 70. He does have weapon strength, which is not the greatest, but he does have bonus against large, 90 armor, good speed. He's a very, very tanky, very survivable lord by Skaven standards, and honestly by any standards. He also does have this fancy little ability called Lucky Skull Helm, which provides him with 24% in speed and 33% damage resistance if he is losing in melee combat. So definitely allows him to just stay afloat in bad situations. He also does have the usual Verminous Valor, standard die, and then stay here, I'll get help, which is a unique ability that gives him stock, as well as allows him to give allies leadership. He also does have Tretch's Raiders, which is an AoE 10% weapon damage, armor piercing damage, and melee attack boost, which will be really potent in this situation, where I'm going with very potent sort of melee comp in the front line. Alongside him, I did actually bring two non-Vanguard units, though. I did decide to bring a Plague Priest. For the utility spells, mostly he does a Vermintide, which allows him to spawn clan rats, Wither for the armor debuff to make my slingers even more effective, and then Blessed with Filth for poison, just debuff enemy troops. And he's also not a terrible melee combatant. The Plague Priest does have armor piercing damage, he does have contamination, which even against dwarves could be useful, and of course he does have Frenzy, so just a very, very potent sort of combat hero in general. Definitely comparable to, say, something like a, perhaps not quite as powerful, but definitely similar in some ways to something like a Branch Wraith. We also do have a Doom Wheel, and if you're wondering why I brought the Doom Wheel, well, it's fast so he can get across the map quickly. It also does do armor piercing damage, has a bonus against infantry, has armor. Dwarves have a really bad time for chariots, especially now that, and now they're definitely once again a little weaker because their Tormentor Sword Snare got nerfed. And of course the chariot does cause fear and terror, which against cheaper dwarven armies is very, very powerful. For my actual army composition, my front line is composed entirely of Death Runners, 6 units of them, which is the max you can bring. Death Runners are not really a dedicated combat troop. They have very low model count and they have very low HP, especially by Skaven standards. But they do have this fancy little ability called Weeping Blade, which drops any armor by 50%, and that'll make my slingers on the flanks far more effective. They also do have decent weapon strength, that's armor piercing, with 30. They're very mobile. They also do have smoke bombs, which means they can close the distance without taking too much fire. And once they're in melee, they'll definitely do okay against the dwarves, and hopefully kind of slice and dice their way through them, especially with the backing of Tretch Craventail's AoE buff, which will activate once he's in melee. On the flanks, we do have 5 units of Night Runner Slingers. These guys are not normally good against dwarves at all, but with the debuffs from the Plague Priest as well as from the Death Runners, my opponent's armor can actually drop to 0 potentially, depending on what units I target. That would make him very, very potent. My opponent decided to go with a massive army and a very campy army. You can see the catapults already going off. I'm trying to scatter my Death Runners away from the non-invisible troops because, of course, while the Death Runners do have stock, Tretch does not need to do the Night Runners, and I don't want these guys taking unnecessary fire if I can avoid it. So my opponent went very wide. He did bring a vanilla Dwarf Lord with just stand your ground, so nothing fancy. But of course, the Dwarf Lord is very tanky and very survivable. He's not quite as tanky, I think, as Tretch, but still very, very strong. My opponent's front line is composed entirely of Dwarf Warriors and with some supporting Longbeards. So there's a little bit of psychological immunity, a bit of encouragement here and there, and just very, very hard for most Skaven troops to break, just because it's so tanky and so resilient. Skaven troops don't have the best of stats, of course. You can see that some catapult shots do go in, and unfortunately I was not on top of my micro here, so some of my Death Runners end up taking some of the catapult shots intended for the Night Runners. And behind that, my opponent does have some long range with great weapons just to shut down some, if I brought, for example, Storm Vermin or some armored troops like a Doom Wheel, and he also does have 2 units of hammers. I definitely think this isn't really necessary against Skaven. I think you're better off just bringing shielded troops and relying on maybe a handful of Thunders against armors, but can definitely be pretty powerful. And with these miners in the back, I'm definitely going to have a hard time getting full charge bonus values onto these hammers. Where you can see my Night Runners definitely pecking away at my opponent's troops, and now I'm popping my concealment bombs before making my push into my opponent's back line, which is composed of these 2 grudge throwers as well as 3 units of portalers, who can of course do a lot of hurt to my cheap and squishy infantry. So you can see I do finally launch my push. I've got my Plague Priest pushing in the front, backed up by Tretch Craventail, of course, and you can see smoke bombs, concealment bombs going off. And this is a really basically enhanced stock. These guys will have normally at this point you'd probably be spotted, but with concealment bombs, your opponent really won't be able to spot you. Unfortunately, I make a huge mistake here and allow the Plague Priest to take a huge amount of fire from the Quarrelers at basically point blank. But he's getting into the fray now. You can see the little Doom Wheel lasers going in as the Doom Wheel begins his mad dash into the fray, into the heart of the fight here. Charging into the Dwarf Warriors, who of course do have charge defense against large, but at this point I'm really collapsing my opponent's troops from all sides. And the first debuffs are really going down. You can see the Doom Wheel causing some immense work here. Withers going down. My opponent's troops, you can see some of them drop down to 0 armor as the Death Runners do get into the fray and start slicing and dicing their way through these Longbeards. Over here, the Plague Priest is tied down, fighting some Dwarf Warriors, but with the help of these Death Runners, it should be able to muck them up and drag them into the dirt. In the meantime, you can see the Slingers pecking away at the enemy great weapons, which are of course unshielded and susceptible. Over here, the Doom Wheel kind of running amok, doing whatever the heck it feels like, and this Wither effect is just demolishing my opponent's troops. Over here on the flanks, you can see Death Runners bogging down my opponent's troops. The Dwarf Warriors are kind of getting in each other's way. They're kind of tripping over each other almost as they're trying to get into position to contest. Unfortunately, I make a bit of a mistake here, not getting my Night Runners into a better position to sling away at these Longbeards. So they're not quite getting maximum value. And the Longbeards are definitely causing some hurt to the Death Runners. They're not really that much. In the meantime, my opponent's shooting has essentially been neutralized. Granted, his Grudge Throwers can still throw rocks at the Knights Runners, but it's really not going to be enough. Where you can see the Clan Rats are trying to shut down the Quarrelers as well as the Grudge Thrower, and with the help of the Doom Wheel, of course, I'm going to be able to start routing troops and forcing breach here and there in my opponent's lines. The Dwarf Lord is doing some massive work here, just backing up his line. You can see the Longbeards are getting, I do believe, a little slightly debuffed with morale. I do believe in I'm not entirely sure if Contaminate affects Longbeards. It's one of those things I simply don't know. But it might. I know they're immune to psychology, but I'm not entirely sure if they're immune to that sort of stuff. You can see that some of the Death Runners are finally starting to rout. Those are Clan Rats, but some of these Death Runners are definitely on the verge of routing. Some of them are definitely not winning their fights. You can see over here, for example, the Death Runners with the help of the Night Runner Slingers are going to drag these Longbeards to the muck. It's important to keep in mind that Death Runners are pretty expensive. They're 950 gold units, so definitely as a support unit, they're very strong, but they're also very expensive. My opponent's front line, though, here definitely getting dragged into the dirt. You can see Death Runners here dying, Quarrelers dying, and the Dwarf Warriors are all getting terror and fear routed by the Doom Wheel, which is just running amok and doing whatever the heck it feels like. Over here, the Plague Priest is tying down these Longbeards with the help of Tretch, Skaven Tail, and unfortunately, though, my opponent's Dwarf Lord is right there, and he's going to start laying the smackdown on this poorly protected Plague Priest. So that's definitely going to be a problem for me. Over here, the Longbeards are trying to pursue the Death Runners, who are now swamping all over the Grudge Thrower, just trying to drag the crew down, slaughter them to a man, get rid of them, and open up, just kind of get rid of all my opponent's shooting, which has been causing some immense damage to me. You can see over here the Quarrelers are really helping break these Death Runners, because of course Death Runners are unshielded, so they'll do very, very poorly against, and very lightly armored, so even despite their physical resistance, they'll do terrible against Quarreler fire. But by and large, my opponent's troops are definitely starting to kind of buckle. Dwarf Warriors, while they're decent melee combatants, especially in survivability, they won't actually do that well against Night Runners, who have okay melee stats, especially with the mass and raw numbers. The Death Runners here have popped concealment bombs just to kind of move around a little bit better if they get rid of these troops. Bit of an unnecessary cast, but still cool. Over here, the Lord is being massively debuffed as in the armor department. These Death Runners are sticking around to 16 models. They've got 109 kills. You can see them been slaughtering these Dwarves. And with the help of Tretch, they're doing really well. Of course, they will kind of fall apart eventually, but as far as Skaven goes, lasting to this long is ridiculous. They're a very, very potent unit. They're definitely one of my favorite units, and I think one of those underutilized gems. Over here, the Longbeards with great weapons have broken, and these miners over here are also getting run down. The Night Runners with slings still around kicking, still lobbing rocks here and there, just trying to peck away at enemy troops. Though definitely that would be better used here against these Dwarf Warriors, who are chewing through these Death Runners very, very quickly. And the Death Runners are definitely raking in kills, but it's not proportional to how much money they've cost me. Over here, the Death Runners are kind of finally getting overwhelmed by a horde of angry hammers and angry stunties there. Hammers, of course, do not have immunity to psychology, which is interesting, but definitely makes them more susceptible to some of my abilities. Over here you can see the Plague Priest still around kicking, a handful of Death Runners still around kicking. You can see the Night Runners applying some pressure, but the bar is dead even, and we still got a long ways to go in this game. Over here, Tretch, Skaven Tail kind of diving in against the Hammers. I do pop Vermin as Valor because I simply don't want him fighting Hammers if I can avoid it. In the meantime, the Doom Wheel is just kind of running amok, doing damage to these Quarrelers, and trying to terror and fear out my opponent's troops. If I can get rid of these guys, if I can make them rout, then I can chase them off the field. I can commit my Night Runners to pursuing. That would really be a huge boon. Over here, the Hammer is still on 5,000 HP, and despite my best efforts, I'm simply not being able to shut them down with the Night Runners with slings. Over here, some of the Death Runners are starting to come back. You can see I'm trying to get clear of with the Death Runners here and there. These Death Runners are going to close on these Longbeards and hopefully collapse them pretty quickly on the charge. They do have a decent charge bonus of 20, and the Doom Wheel is kind of running amok, doing whatever the heck it feels like, getting rear charges, and over here Death Runners are getting in the fray, trying to tie down these Dwarf Warriors and buy me some time. Unfortunately for me, though, the Plague Priest is going to rout, and he's simply not going to come back. And the magic would have been very useful here, but it's simply not going to happen. And as he does get chased off by a bunch of angry Longbeards. Over here, the hammers are really the central focus of all of my shooting, because they are by far the biggest threat. They can do a lot of damage. They are very tanky, and should it come down to the fight of my lord against their lord and just the hammers will be able to drag Tretch into the dirt if it comes down to it. Whereas a lot of the other dwarf units simply have terrible melee stats as far as their offensive stats go. They just don't do a lot of damage, so not that powerful. I'm definitely trying to focus the Night Runner fire on these hammers, run them down with the Doom Wheel wherever I can, and use the Night Runners over here to peck away at the Longbeards in the meantime. I'm going to get a rear charge into these Quarrelers, and you can see the Quarrelers are immediately against a buckle and they get tear-routed by the Doom Wheel, which then opens up the opportunity for my Night Runner Slingers to chase them off the battlefield if they are able. Unfortunately, my infantry corps at this point is basically annihilated. You can see Tretch running for dear life against the Dwarf Lord. Over here, Night Runners with slings are about to be charged by hammers, and we can watch some poor rats getting crushed here by the hammers. But you can see the hammers definitely, as you can see, aren't necessarily picking off models all that well. And the Night Runners, if they so are forced to, they will retreat and they will be able to outrun these guys. They actually have 61 speed right now, so they're very quick, and they're going to be able to get clear and drag these guys away and distract them. Over here, the Doom Wheel is running down a handful of Longbeards, but unfortunately the Longbeards do have that psychological risk, but they've just been so broken up at this point that even with psychological immunity, they're going to fall apart. Over here, Tretch is trying to run down these Dwarf Warriors. My Night Runners with slings running off, and really at this point, my army has just been reduced in a bunch of Night Runners with slings, and a handful of Night Runners with slings have ammo, but honestly, it's actually really rough. You can see the bar is definitely shifting in my opponent's favor a little bit. My opponent is kind of reduced. His artillery is basically gone, but he still does have this corps of hammers. He still does have this blob of Dwarf Warriors. And most of my units are just routing off at this point. My Death Runners refuse to come back despite rallying for a little bit. And so now it's really Tretch, a handful of Night Runners, most of which are out of ammo, and a very low HP Doom Wheel, which now I'm trying to kind of take advantage. It's very important, and you'll see this from other YouTubers, you'll see this from a lot of people in Quick Match. If you manage to make a unit rout, you want to pursue it off the field. That's why it's very useful if you outnumber your opponent. It's very useful just to run his troops off the field. So I've gotten rid of those Dwarf Warriors. Over here, I'm chasing this Grudge Thrower down. Gonna get rid of them. Honestly, it may seem silly. It's just a crew, but even the Dwarf crews can lay a little bit of damage down, and Night Runners with slings get rid of them there, and so that's definitely very useful. Over here in the pits, you can see the fight of the shooters. You got the Quarrelers slugging out with the Night Runners with slings. Night Runners have a lot more models. Night Runners have worse melee stats than the Quarrelers, and of course they don't have all the armor, but they do have numbers. So potentially in a drawn-out fight, they can do okay. Especially if a Doom Wheel kind of plows into the back of my opponent's troops. And now you can see there's second unit Night Runners with slings on top of the Quarrelers. And once the Doom Wheel gets its charge in, you can see the glorious Doom Wheel running through, turning some dwarves into red paste. And you got the guy there pumping the wheel, and they're just moving. So finally, my opponent's troops are really kind of being run off the field. You can see Dwarf Warriors here routed, the Quarrelers here routed. I'm using the last of my ammunition to soften up the hammers. They do have psychological immunity, and they're definitely the biggest threat by far at this point. You can see the battle lines are once again kind of being redrawn. At this point, I'm down to just this shooting. Having these Night Runners pursue the Dwarf Warriors off the field. I'm trying to have these Night Runners over here chase the Quarrelers off the field, but it's really not quite working out. And I'm kind of just redrawing the lines with whatever's left. You can see my opponent down to 89, 87. His troops count is of course dropping because the Dwarf Warriors are being run down and slaughtered. But definitely the fight, while the numbers are very much in my favor, if my opponent is able to massacre these Night Runners or perhaps get a gank on Tretch Skaven Tail, things will go very badly. And this is definitely where Tretch's resistance against being assassinated is very good. You can see that here I do get a rear charge on the hammers. I'm getting them enveloped with all the Night Runners, just trying to break their morale. Because honestly, if this fight actually lasted and it was an actual fight, chances are the hammers would actually still come out on top against the Night Runners, because the Night Runners don't have the best of weapon strength. 26, 6 of that armor piercing, but with the terror route coming in, the Night Runners will break the hammers, and the hammers are just going to get dragged down to the muck. So this is definitely going to be huge for me. You see my opponent's army is now reduced to the Lord, but he's still fighting. He's a real champion of the Dwarves there, and the Night Runners have finished off those Dwarves over there. So at this point, my opponent's been reduced just this Lord, but nonetheless, the Lord just has such crazy stats. I no longer have any armor debuffs available, so at 120 armor, and of course, Tretch doesn't have any real attack bonuses. He does have the bonus for winning a fight that activates the Tretch's Raiders, but nonetheless, that's still not that potent. It's still not really going to help him that much. And you can see this Lord just tanking it out and doing a pretty good job. So I'm going to pull Tretch out and try to throw him back into the fight. Try to soften up that Lord a little more. I definitely think Tretch is pretty solid here. And as you can see, we've kind of run these hammers off the field, and we're definitely in a good position. I'd use the Doom Wheel to finish off these Quarrelers, chase them off the field for good, and now it's really just a matter of whittling down this Dwarf Lord. So we're going to throw things into fast forward a little bit. You can see definitely the Dwarf Lord kind of getting distracted here and there by Tretch. I'm trying to get cycle charges into him, but with his monster's melee defense, it's just very hard to kill. The Doom Wheel runs him over, does practically nothing. He's still tanky. He refuses to surrender. You can see, despite the fact that he's exhausted and is fluctuating between melee, combat even, and losing. The Dwarf Lord's definitely kind of holding his own. And we still got 40 seconds of the fray. I'm trying to cycle charge him with the Doom Wheel. I don't want to lose either Tretch or the Doom Wheel. You can see some of my Night Runners are actually routing at this point, or they were definitely wavering. I do get a stand your ground off, which makes my troops a little tankier, but you can see the Dwarf Lord sitting at about 1200 HP when he finally does break, and giving me a Pyrrhic victory. So definitely a very, very tight match. You can see the Dwarves, when you look at the losses, you can see just how unbreakable the Dwarves can really be. That said, if you look at the Death Runner casualties, most of the Death Runner units came to the brink of annihilation. Death Runners are definitely pretty powerful. I think they're one of those better units in the Skaven roster that gets overlooked because people tend to do strats that center around Rat Ogres or Doom Wheels or Plague Monks. And so the Death Runners get overlooked, but these sort of Vanguard strats are actually very, very powerful. And honestly, if you're doing a strategy even with Plague Monks or something, try out Death Runners. They're not a bad support unit. That 50% armor debuff, especially if you combine it with Wither, means enemy units just collapse. Even heavily armored troops are simply not going to be able to hold up against that many debuffs. Otherwise, the Night Runner Slingers did some pretty good work. Even in late game, they were dragging enemy troops into the muck, just surrounding them and beating them to death. The Doom Wheel, of course, very powerful, got 2 chevrons. Tretch just good at surviving. I made some major mistakes with my Plague Priest, and I got him killed way too soon, or routed off. And so that definitely hurt me in the long run. Had I had poison available in the later stages of the fight, had I been able to summon some clan rats and that sort of stuff, it would have definitely put me in a much stronger position in the late game. Perhaps allowed me to keep a handful of Death Runners around kicking, which would have once again proved useful in the late game when I was dealing with a bunch of armored troops without really that much armor piercing. Nonetheless, great game to my opponent, Federico. Your very unique strat coming out. I don't necessarily agree with the use of great weapons. I don't think great weapons are necessary against Skaven. I think Slayers would have been a much better investment. Bringing 3 units of Slayers in this sort of composition would have made much more sense. The only units that are very heavily armored in the Skaven roster are Doom Wheels. And for those, you're much better off bringing Thunders because they are much harder to, because they will of course shoot the Doom Wheel down. The Hammers will just get run over. Yeah, they might get a handful of hits into the Doom Wheel before it sneaks past, but they're just not really going to be able to do the damage. And so if you're dealing with enemy armor, I think if you're dealing with heavily armored Doom Wheels, you really need cannon or something like that. My opponent would have probably been better off dropping this blob of great weapons for 2 Thunders and 2 Slayers or something like that. Would have definitely been a better investment in my opinion. Nonetheless, great game to my opponent. I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe down below to keep up with additional content. If you have any comments, criticism, anything like that, be sure to post it down below and I'll respond as soon as I can. As usual, I do appreciate you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.